Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first Echo session on storytelling, and we're delighted to have you here. This project is funded by the Centers for Disease Control, awarded to 108 health departments participating in OT 21-2103. And we want to recognize and thank CDC and all the health departments for taking part in that. Today's session is the first of 3 sessions. It's designed to be democratized data, highlighting best practices to reduce structural and implicit bias in data collection. This kickoff session creates space to explore the life cycle of inclusive and ethical data best practices, including reviewing data governance strategies, determining the necessary stakeholders, defining impactful data, and revealing methods for iterative analysis. Presenters and panelists will share how they are collecting and using data to close equity gaps. Furthermore, our equity in action case study will highlight how focusing on the process instead of the outcomes can lead to better results. Participants will also have an opportunity to share their own stories with their peers to promote learning. We want to recognize and thank our interpreters and the folks that are doing captioning today. This is an important part of what we're trying to do with these Echo series, and appreciate the opportunity that they're providing us to do this work. With that, let me introduce Libby McClure, who is our first subject matter expert. Libby is the health data analyst with DataWorks NC in North Carolina. It is a Durham-based North Carolina nonprofit whose mission is to conduct community-driven research. She received her PhD in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2020. Her dissertation was a collaborative project with the Concerned Citizen of West Baden and the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Her work is focused on the ways in which historical and structural inequalities produce health disparities. She seeks involvement in social and environmental justice-focused research that both critically complicates traditional study of health and illness while also supporting social change. Libby, it is great to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us, and it's all yours.
Well, thanks for that introduction, John. And as you said, I'm Libby McClure. I'm with DataWorks NC, and we are based in Durham, North Carolina. And this is our mission on this slide. So we're a Durham nonprofit who democratizes data to facilitate an empowered, productive, and equitable community. And we do this by prioritizing Durham's communities of color, low income, and historical disinvestment. And our work is in collaboration with neighbors, communities, nonprofits, and local agencies that share goals of racial equity and community power. Durham is located in central North Carolina, on land that was not ceded to white settlers by the Shakori, Occaneechi, Eno, and Tuscarora people who preceded white colonial settlement. We're a mid-sized city experiencing rapid gentrification and displacement, and the county population in 2020 was 324,000. And to save some time, I'm going to invite you to learn more about our community by visiting a couple of our neighborhood data tools, which are available in both Spanish and English, and I'll drop those links in the chat. And in this talk, I'll discuss the importance of historical contextualization and relationship building with a power analysis. And I'll illustrate our process through 2 examples. The first theme is history and context. So for our work, we're presenting information. We start with the long arc of history and an acknowledgement of what history created and how it created our current reality. and that this method by which racism in America moved through all contemporary iterations of policy, political, economy, culture, etc. And so we can look at specific data examples then through that lens. And today we'll talk about Who Owns Durham, which is a project and presentation aimed at Durham's political leadership, documenting historic and contemporary systems of segregation and displacement with an emphasis on actionable mitigation strategies. And the second theme is process and relationships. So when we talk about data collection, process is as important as interpretation. And one of our core values at DataWorks is to value the process equally with outcomes. And that's a common imbalance we see in quantitative data work. So data collection are what bring us toward equitable and useful quantitative data collection and analysis. So the Data Equity Coalition Project example, we'll talk about the themes that emerged from our community partners on how to collect survey data on structural racism and health. So to start with history and context, this slide references the deeper historical context of residential segregation in Durham. So we strive to avoid accepting contemporary statistics without their due historical influences. Segregation has been manufactured and recreated by our forebears, which becomes clear with historical context. So a super quick rundown of these 6 really complex images. We begin many of our presentations like this, taking time to illustrate how the data today, maps and charts, don't make a full and total representation of the histories that are very present in our housing statistics. So nothing in today's data points would be what they are without the influence of history. And each one of these representations bears directly on each of our work in racial equity and relies on data. So for us, this also gives a chance to name a few issues that we face in trying to honestly and equitably share statistical data. So we always start by observing that we're on and managing land of the Shakori, Tuscarora, and people who preceded colonial settlement. And this is the best geographic representation we know of that presence from the native land digital. And then moving on to that center top image, white settlers developed the first comprehensive distribution of land and measuring it closely to establish property ownership and a system for managing ownership. So it's pretty similar to the parcel fabric that we use today. This map of land grants covers all the land, and the power of claiming territory within boundaries on maps is established for Durham here between 1750 and 1800. And then not long after that, moving to the right top image, the accumulation of large areas of Durham for agricultural production using enslaved Black and Indigenous labor became the predominant characteristic of mapped land. So the gray area is showing the extent of the Cameron plantations, which were approximately 32,000 acres of Durham, Wake, and Granville counties. And it's important to keep in mind that plantation land use dominated in the antebellum times, but also long after. So this known extent of the Cameron lands is shown for 1890. But the end of slavery on Cameron land led to a foundational period of migration toward and into Durham. And there are other plantation histories in our current neighborhood landscape in Durham as well. And then moving to the bottom left image, property always had rules stratifying us by whether we could legally own land and how much we could accumulate. And when it became illegal to formally zone communities by race in 1917, other privately controlled tools like racially restrictive deed covenants were used. So these were used from the 1920s until 1948 legally. And then they were continued to be used through the 1960s as a standard practice by many large institutions like Duke University in Durham. And they're still very much a part of our landscape and difficult to remove. And then moving to the bottom center, Other entanglements of law and private lending, private selling were rife throughout the 20th century. But a generation after racial zoning was made illegal, the indelible inscription of the Homeowners Loan Corporation risk maps have become an essential iconography of American apartheid. So redlining, yes, red areas, but also blue and green just as much. These data were used to lock generations of Black and other racial ethnic minority groups out of lending, but also used to protect and prioritize white and upper class neighborhoods. So we try to use that data to identify the privileging that happened and not simply reproduce anti-Black narratives. And then finally, the bottom right image, a generation into red and green lining, city projects doubled down in Durham, literally bulldozing Black neighborhoods with federal money. This was a really data-intensive process with a full inventory of housing in areas deemed to be blighted that documented the value, profitability, and characteristics of each property. The Durham County Urban Renewal Archives is an excellent resource for learning more about that. And these two images are from the Bull City 150 Uneven Ground exhibit. The image on the right is from 1972, when the work of dismantling the Black neighborhood of Hayti was nearing its completion. So we can look at specific data examples then through that lens and reference how a single phenomenon like the pandemic are not what actually produces just disparate outcomes. Housing as a system in America does, housing as a system in America does that. The disparities long precede individual crises. So when we look at the disparity in evictions, based on highly segregated geography, looking at census tracts that are 66% or more people of color. In a given month, between 65 and 75% of evictions happen in those areas in Durham. But since 2017, 88% of all eviction processes that happened in parts of Durham that are 50% more Black, Indigenous people of color, and only 2.6% have happened in predominantly white census blocks. So moving into the second theme, process and relationships, I'm going to talk about health equity work in Durham County. So every other year, the Durham County Health Department runs the Durham County Community Health Assessment. And it's repeatedly shown racism to be a primary issue of concern for Durham community members. And Durham's longstanding coalition of health-focused community organizations and members, called the Partnership for a Healthy Durham, established a racial equity task force and adopted racial equity principles in response to the 2017 community health assessment. And those results, as well as frequently voice community concerns. So following that, DataWorks hosted 3 community conversations to discuss the intersection of racism and health. And we recruited participants largely through the Partnership for a Healthy Durham. We had 12 participants join us who were leaders of community organizations. 11 of those participants worked in public health. 11 are members of the Partnership for a Healthy Durham, and 20 of the 24 total were from historically marginalized communities of Durham. And I'm showing a word cloud of what image, word, or phrase comes to mind when you think of health equity. So we started by discussing how folks envision health equity, and they said fairness and justice, equal access, everyone's needs are met. And then we talked about how public health agencies in North Carolina use national survey data from the CDC and how it can be improved from an anti-racist perspective. The first key takeaway was around structural racism. So I'll read a quote from that represents that takeaway. These reports don't address root causes and completely miss the mark. These are all important things to address, but we need to tackle the foundation in order to resolve the issues. people put band-aids or low-hanging objectives that can be checked off, but it needs to be levels deeper. So structural determinants of health should be centered instead of individual behaviors and risk factors. Our systems of funding and healthcare are rooted in racist histories, and public health research and communication is often focused on individual biology, behaviors, risk factors. And this perpetuates a narrative of personal responsibility, which is visible in the existing uses of national data in North Carolina. The next takeaway was government accountability. So one participant said, we have people working every day, and we know what we want to see changed. Give those people organizing already the resources they need to implement the solutions we've already come up with. Solutions that are not designed with us are not designed for us and won't work for us. Stop having listening sessions and using our ideas to make money. Folks who are already out here filling gaps we didn't create need to be recognized and compensated. I want firm commitments about what investments CDC and our government systems plan to make into the community. Where's the proof from them that they're going to use the money responsibly? I want to see receipts. So more transparency and accountability is needed from government when it comes to resources dedicated toward health equity. Folks want to know, where do government funds dedicated toward health equity go? Resources should be dedicated to community, and specifically those organizers who are already doing that work. And the next takeaway was words matter. One participant said, these behavioral metrics that North Carolina uses come from a deficit-based perspective. It's ignoring the structural factors that lead to poor health and risk behaviors. So most public health data documentation is framed to focus on deficits instead of assets. Public health data does not focus enough on prevention, and deficit-focused metrics and language can be alienating. Community input on language can make CDC reports and North Carolina Health Department documentation and tools more inclusive. Folks pointed out that phrases like sedentary lifestyle or burden can feel judgmental. So deficit-focused metrics and language are stigmatizing, and community input on language would make reports and tools more inclusive. So our community member participants made a few recommendations for the survey. They want a list of health issues included and focused on, like aging, COVID-19 and vaccine access, safety, racial disparities, water quality. And they made specific recommendations around data as well, like to disaggregate reported numbers by race, ethnicity, and gender, to make data available at smaller geographic units to reflect more localized experiences, and to make detailed data available and accessible on how federal funds are distributed and who receives them. So our key takeaways are to acknowledge the historical origins of our current realities, and to remember that relationship building and community input are fundamental components of equitable and useful quantitative data collection processes. And so with that, I'll move into a case study based on these takeaways. The challenge is to address structural racism, promote government accountability, and ensure equity in data collection and evaluation processes. And the goal is to develop comprehensive strategies that tackle the root causes of structural racism, ensure government accountability and data collection and evaluation, and promote equity in these processes. So the options are addressing root causes, providing necessary resources for equitable data collection and evaluation, recognizing and compensating individuals for filling those gaps, demanding transparency and accountability in government investments, and promoting inclusive and representative data practices. There are a number of important risks associated with it, such as inequitable data collection. So there's a risk of collecting data that fails to capture the experiences and perspectives of marginalized communities, which perpetuates inequities and limits understanding of structural racism. There's also biased evaluation processes. So without ensuring equity in evaluation methodologies, there's a risk of perpetuating biased conclusions and overlooking the impacts of structural factors on marginalized communities. And then finally, marginalizing community organizers. So without dedicating the due resources and support to the community organizers already working toward equity solutions, there is a risk of marginalizing their efforts and missing valuable insights from their approaches. So these 4 discussion questions around the case study are: first, how can we effectively address the root causes of structural racism and move beyond superficial interventions to promote lasting change? The second is, what steps can be taken to provide the necessary resources to support community organizers who have already developed solutions to addressing structural racism? Third, how can individuals filling gaps in the system be properly recognized and compensated for their contributions in addressing structural inequalities? And finally, what measures should be implemented to ensure transparency, accountability, and responsible use of investments made by government systems to address structural racism and promote community well-being? And with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Libby. This was fascinating. It really illuminates the important work that you're doing in Durham, and particularly with beginning with Indigenous people in the Durham area and then moving it forward to what you're facing now. So thank you very much for both the presentation and for the case study. With that, we'll go to our first panelist. Jameson Green has a PhD in equalities law, also has a master's in fine art and creative writing. He's past president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health and the current co-chair of WPATH's Ethics Committee. He's an accomplished trans activist, policy consultant, educator, and author of the award-winning monograph, Becoming a Visible Man, numerous journal articles, and a contributor to many other books. He has worked for over 32 years to build empowerment within the transgender community and to engage non-transgender professionals in assisting trans people in overcoming the barriers they experience that prohibit them from full participation in society, whether that's in employment, access to healthcare, inclusion in research, and access to education and professional development, or in the political spheres that generate legislation, regulations, and policies that impact a transgender person's daily life. So with that, Jameson, we look forward to hearing your perspectives on Libby's presentation, and it's all yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I was very impressed with Libby's presentation. I thought that there was a very responsible approach to both the historical impacts and the processes that developed the conditions that we're dealing with in the present, but also the conscientiousness about including people who have been historically marginalized, and also the people who are clearly engaged at the community level who are making strides that are invisible to people in positions of power. People impacting each other's lives is happening constantly. But what I've often seen in research settings is a tendency to just go to who you know, just we need to find out this data, we need to figure out this, solve this problem. Who knows about that? Oh, this person over here who I worked with before, and who's these ways of shortcutting because we're on a tight budget, we're on a tight timetable. there's often not enough exploration of what is going on the ground. And I think that Libby's perspective really outlines that those gaps that need to be filled conscientiously by people who have the power to collect and analyze data. I just thought it was an excellent presentation. You know, in a lot of my work, I've seen a lot of desperation to address situations that are not always, how to say this, sort of non-specifically. They're not always clearly defined. We see the pain, we see the struggle, we see the conflict that people are experiencing, but we don't always know how to approach it in a way that can actually draw people in, engage them, and respectfully get their experience so that we can apply that knowledge to our own view of solutions. I think that often institutionalized racism, for example, is a very clear topic to address because it's invisible to so many people. That invisibility is, as an example, makes it difficult to recognize where we have not connected because we don't see what the connections are. The marginalized communities in general are looked at as insufficient contributors to society, and therefore their human experience is ignored. This is I think, a difficult position to be in for a researcher who's under pressure sometimes because of grant situations or budget situations in the institution where we work. And we see that there's a problem, but we don't know how to address it. And I think stepping back, as Libby demonstrated, stepping back and looking at the big picture really, really helps, and can ultimately, while it takes a little time to develop that, ultimately that approach can have an impact that is much more responsive at the ground level, at the individual level. I'm not exactly sure what else to say about that. Is there another question to ask?
I think we're good on that. Really appreciate your time, Jameson and Libby. Lifting up the invisible should be and can be an important part of our work. And I think this session really helps demonstrate that. Again, we want to thank our folks that did our interpreting and captioning today. That's a very important piece of what we're trying to convey to make these echo sessions much more inclusive and available to people in how they best hear the information, listen to the information, watch it, and begin to act on it. The next session that will follow this is on humanizing the narrative, the best practices in telling the story. And so this particular session really does help set the foundation for what we want to do with storytelling, because once we understand where the invisible people are and we want to lift up that to make folks more visible, then how do we tell those stories to help make this begin to work? One additional thing that, let me go back to Jameson to, because we can cut and paste on this. Libby, can you put the questions back up on the case study, and let's walk through those, Jameson, and see if you can provide some thoughts on that as well. So the first one is, how can we effectively address the root causes of structural racism and move beyond superficial interventions to promote lasting change? So thoughts, Jameson?
I think there has to be the acceptance of consciousness that a change is desired, and a recognition of the true humanity of the people who have been marginalized. I think that is a serious barrier at times. I mean, we say, oh yes, they're a human being, but do we really understand what they've suffered, what they've been through, and how they need to be respected, and what's going to make them feel respected and included and understood?
Excellent. And this next one, what steps can be taken to provide the necessary resources and support to community organizers who have already developed solutions addressing structural racism? Any thoughts from that perspective?
I think they need to be invited into conversations with people who they perceive as having power and influence, and they need to be treated in those conversations as equal partners, and they need to be recognized for the contributions that they've made, and their ideas have to be listened to, they have to be spoken clearly to and acknowledged, and they need to not be dismissed or overlooked or ignored, frankly.
Go ahead, I'm
yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was particularly struck by the comments that Libby brought up from the individuals, the quotes in there, and thinking about the 108 grantees that we have in this project and how they work with their local community collaborating organizations. This becomes an important piece for how do they work with those community organizers to lift up the people. The third question, how can individuals filling gaps in the system be properly recognized and compensated for their contributions in addressing structural inequalities? And Libby, I am so glad that you put in there the piece on compensation, and some of our work that we do is how do we continue to value the fair compensation of folks in the community? So Jameson, thoughts on that one?
Well, it needs to be written into grant applications for research. It needs to be that is a budget line item that should be always considered, and it needs to be meaningful, not just trivial. It needs to be actually something that is significantly acknowledging what people bring to the table.
Yeah, it's that lived experience, and in addition, particularly the mental burden in sharing some of that lived experience, which may be the experience that a lot of folks, particularly empowered, just don't understand. So compensating folks for that is important. Last question: what measures should be implemented to ensure transparency, accountability, and responsible use of investments made by government systems to address structural racism and promote community well-being. Again, just really, Libby, you did an excellent job in describing that. But Jameson, what are your thoughts, particularly in transparency and the use of government funding?
Well, again, inviting people to the table, people who can transmit the information to the community, and who will responsibly do that. I think I like that quote about, I want to see receipts. I want to know how this money's being spent. That was powerful. It's so often we ignore what's going on around us because we're just dealing with our day-to-day activities and challenges. But when we're trying to engage with a power structure or a system that has historically neglected us, there's an emotional barrier there that needs to be deconstructed. And I think that eye contact with people, sharing information with people, inviting them in, inviting their responses all the time, not just, oh, we'll talk to you next week, sort of thing. But let's really engage here. We need to look at these issues and these systems together. Otherwise, we will not be able to make a decision over here that gets implemented over here in any meaningful way that changes things.
Yeah, and going back to the slide that had the 6 maps on it, Libby, that historical perspective is so important.
Yeah.
Libby, go ahead, Jameson.
I was just going to say, I'm struck and I'm always frequently struck by the system of owning property and how that was imposed on this land and the people who lived here, and then all the structures that build out from that, and the impact that has on people just trying to live their lives and survive in harmony with the land. Everything else is busy work and power exchange and money systems and all this, and it's not actually addressing anybody's needs other than to accumulate more power and more wealth. And that's very, very frustrating, and that's clearly represented in those maps.
Libby, any thoughts from your perspective and what we've just heard from Jameson?
Yeah, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the generosity of our community participants in sharing these thoughts and, continuing to work in a system that hasn't acknowledged them, hasn't compensated them, and then yet still being willing to contribute these sort of mic drop moments of, I want to see the receipts. These words are stigmatizing. Here's, these are such gifts that they're offering to us as researchers that are going to make our work more meaningful. So that's sort of what's ringing in my head right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for sharing this information. I think it gives us some thoughts that we should all be reflecting on as we do our work in our individual health departments and in the communities in which we serve. Again, thank you also to our interpreters and the folks providing captioning. That's a very important part of our work, and hopefully will be taken up by each of the health departments as they begin to put some of these projects in place in the localities. With that, we encourage you to attend the next 2 storytelling sessions. The next one is on Humanize the Narrative, Best Practices for Telling the Whole Story. And then our third one will be deeply rooted data, exploring traditional and indigenous best practices for storytelling. And Libby, once again, that you're really setting the foundation for those two particular echo sessions with what you're doing here. So thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you in the next two echo sessions.